when I started my job here 23, 24 years ago, that at that point I had never worked on dinosaurs before, believe it or not. I'd worked on fossil lizards and a lot of other kind of stuff, but they said, if you want a job here, if we hire you, you have to work on dinosaurs. And I said, sure, I can figure this out, we'll be fine. And so there were a lot of people who thought that birds might be related to crocodiles, they might be related to ancestral archosaurs, which is just kind of a weird group of reptiles, but they might be related to birds as well. And the fact that, that the ideas had just been proposed that birds were nested within dinosaurs, that birds are a kind of dinosaur, just like humans are a kind of primate. I mean, that's over. We all know now that birds are more closely related to Tyrannosaurus rex than Tyrannosaurus rex is to almost any other dinosaur that you may have heard of. But now we're really getting into the interesting parts of how that we can understand some of the things about how these animals acted and behaved in the past by using living analogs to do that. And the focus of a lot of the work that we're doing now is the neurobiology of these animals. And Amy has been the prime mover and shakers in my extended laboratory and stuff about this stuff over the last few years, using all sorts of different new technologies to be able to reconstruct dinosaur brains. And now we're moving toward what some of those reconstructions may mean as far as behaviorally and physiologically. So with that, we'll get going. So, Amy.
All right. Well, thanks, Mark. Yeah, this is great to be up here tonight. This is very exciting. Talk about a little bit of my research. So the first question might be, well, why would you want to study bird brains? For one, birds are one of the few groups of vertebrates that attain powered flight. So that's one reason we're interested in what's going on in the evolution of the bird brain. The other reason is that birds reach some of the largest endocranial volumes within vertebrate evolution. So they have volumes on par with mammals. And so this is a great system to study within vertebrates. We can study the origin of the bird's brains by looking only at living taxa. Right here, I've highlighted birds and crocodilians. Birds and crocodilians are most closely related to each other among living vertebrates. But if you look only at these taxa, then you're missing an incredible amount of evolution. The division between these two groups occurred almost 220 million years ago. So there's all of these non-avian dinosaurs plus pterosaurs that are going to be absent from your analyses. And this is what Mark and I are interested in, looking at what's going on in this kind of what we call a stem lineage, or these extinct taxa, to see how their brains are changing.
Yeah, so one of the things that we really want to look at in this is that if you look fundamentally at a bird brain, and we'll get a little bit more into this a little bit later, it's very like a mammalian brain. Anybody who's ever seen that the inside of a human skull or had a CAT scan or whatever knows that the brain totally fills the whole volume of the skull. In crocodiles, it doesn't. There's a lot of loose space in there. They're like a lizard and everything else. So that there's been this total advancement in size of the brain relative to the body and elaboration of the brain as well. And parallelly, that happens in mammals. I mean, if you look at the most primitive mammals or mammal line lineage that's known, that they basically have something that kind of looks like a crocodile brain. But when you get to a modern mammal, it has something that looks like a bird brain. So if it just happens once, it's a one-off. But if it happens twice, there must be a reason for it. So.
Yeah, I'd say there are the underlying developmental networks and gene expressions that what Mark was talking about is one of the things that we're really interested in getting at in the future. But as for now, what I want to talk about is to look at some of these kind of bird-like characters as the fossil record really is basically becoming more complete. As in the last 20 years, there have been incredible discoveries in Mongolia. Mark and Dr. Mike Novacek as well have been able to find.
And yourself.
I've been out there. But as they find incredible, complete, beautifully articulated fossils out in the Gobi Desert, and also again, Mark's found these incredible specimens in China. We're finding that those characters that we initially thought were just associated with living birds, things like feathers and a furcula or a wishbone, or even behaviors like nesting clutches of eggs, things that we first thought were associated only with living birds. Well, it turns out that if you look at that diversity that I showed you before of non-avian dinosaurs, it turns out that these characters actually evolved much earlier in the evolutionary history of that avian lineage than we thought before. And so, again, it's something that if you want to study the origins of the avian brain, well, then it's really not surprising that you would want to go earlier into their history and not just look at living taxa, but look at some of these non-avian dinosaurs as well.
And some of it is just that if you think that there is a dichotomy between birds and dinosaurs, there really isn't. Because probably the iconic dinosaur that you can walk 2 galleries away and go see is Tyrannosaurus rex. And Tyrannosaurus rex had feathers. Tyrannosaurus rex had a wishbone. Tyrannosaurus rex had hollow bones. Tyrannosaurus rex probably sat on top of its nests of eggs, and just like modern birds do. So that these are not really, really different animals. I mean, most non-avian dinosaurs were not big lizards. I mean, that they're more like weird birds than they are like big lizards. So that we have to get by that first, and then we can kind of like start thinking about them in a totally different way.
Yeah, I'd say it's becoming a little less clear what we think a bird is. It's not exactly, like I said, all those characters that you thought were bird-like characters are evolving much earlier in their history. To look at the avian brain, we use CT data, very much like any kind of CT scan that you'd have in a hospital if you have God forbid, if you have like a head injury or something. So that same kind of technology we use to study fossils. It's not really a new thing. We've used this to study fossils probably for the past 20 years or so. Typically, the way we use it is to either just look at the internal anatomy of, say a dinosaur skull or a mammal skull or anything like that. We've also used it to separate the matrix of a fossil from the bone, and so a lot of things that wouldn't be visible in just the specimen itself are made easily visible, with the use of CT data and this digital data. Another example is a project that Mark and I both worked on, this Cretaceous dinosaur egg. So we CT scanned it and then basically isolated all of the embryonic bones within the egg and rendered them separately so that we could describe each bone and helped us identify what was going on within that egg. So this is kind of the technology that we're using to look at these brains, as dinosaur brains as well. So here's just an example of how we do this. So Mark mentioned in birds fill most of the cranial cavity. And in taxa that fill the cranial cavity, things like birds and mammals, so things with very large brains, in these taxa, as the brain develops, it leaves an impression on the internal surface of the brain case, so that if you can somehow digitally fill in that space, that cranial cavity space, and then digitally remove the bones, well then you'll have what is basically a cast of the brain. And this gives you the external surface of the brain. There's really no way to get at the internal or deep structures of the brain at this time, but we can at least look at that superficial morphology of the avian brain. This right here is a living albatross, and so this is what we call an endocast. This is an endocast of a living albatross.
What's so nice about this technique is that what we know about the brain morphology of living birds is basically the same thing, but done in a much more primitive way. Because 30 years ago, if people wanted to look at the brain of a living bird, that before these techniques were developed, they would make a skeleton of it, then they would blow like latex on the inside of the skull, and then dissolve the skull around it. And you would just have a physical thing instead of a virtual thing like we have now, but they're directly comparable.
It's directly comparable, and it's so much nicer because it's not destructive to the specimen at all.
Doesn't smell bad either.
It doesn't smell bad. There are other examples where people would serially section the skull and then manually fill in that cranial cavity space, and that's how they would create their endocast. So basically, they just stack it back up, which is the same thing that we're doing here, except that we're doing it digitally. So it's non-destructive to the specimens, which is really key. So what you see spinning on the screen here is an oviraptor dinosaur that Mark collected in the field. This is what the endocast, and this is actually an endocast of the bony labyrinth of the ear as well. So this is kind of an example of what we can do with this technology. We're not the first ones to really look at these kinds of analyses. This is an example from Larson et al. Basically, this circle represents the distribution of brain volumes versus body size of living birds. Birds have a relatively large brain volume compared to other reptiles. So this is like lizards and snakes and turtles and things like that. What you want to notice is that right in the middle is Archaeopteryx, which is basically been considered the first bird because it lies close to the origin of powered flight and probably had powered flight itself. So
Maybe.
maybe it's a possibility. That's not my area of expertise. But Archaeopteryx has kind of been set up as this transitional fossil between reptile, quote, reptiles and crown group birds or living birds. They are able to draw from basal coelurosaurs, so these are things like Tyrannosaurus. They also, of course, included Archaeopteryx in their studies, as well as living birds. But given that sampling, it's not really that surprising that Archaeopteryx is going to fall right in the middle in that distribution. So that it's not surprising that it's going to have that kind of intermediate position.
So one of the things that we've been able to really bring to the table is both that these ideas that have been floating around there for a long time, combined with some great machinery that exists both at University of Texas Austin and here at the American Museum to be able to scan these things. But the most important thing is that the real currency in understanding these things is the fossils themselves. So about half of these things are things that we've excavated in Mongolia over the last 2 decades.
Exactly, and those are what we were able to bring to this analysis. So those previous studies, like I said, they are very limited in their sampling. What we were able to do is add many of these fossils that we've been able to collect in the Gobi Desert, a few from China as well. Those specimens that we've been able to add have been very close, or much closer to the origin of living birds than those previous analyses were able to sample from. So that's really one thing that sets our analysis apart from those others. Here are our results. This is a plot of total endocranial volume versus body size.
How big the brain is compared to how big your body is.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. So in blue, what we're showing is the distribution of living birds, and they do have, compared to all these other non-avian dinosaurs, they really have a very large brain. But what's really different about our analysis is that Archaeopteryx no longer lies in that kind of intermediate position, but all those other colored dots on the screen, those are all other non-avian dinosaurs that are closely related to Archaeopteryx, not Archaeopteryx. They're a little bit further away from the origin of birds as well. And what this shows is that Archaeopteryx doesn't really especially have there's nothing especially special I guess, about its brain volume. But basically, it has a volume that you would expect of a non-avian dinosaur. Now, one other thing that we were able to do with these data was to partition the brain. So we were able to isolate different parts of the brain. So we could look at the olfactory tracts, or that part of the brain that's responsible for smell, the cerebrum, the major part of the brain that's in charge of any kind of cognitive functions. The optic lobes, obviously vision, and the cerebellum and brainstem as well. So we were able to partition this brain up, which is something that no one else has really thought about doing before. We can look at each of these regions with respect to the total endocranial volume. And just as an example, what I'm showing you here is the volume of the olfactory bulbs with respect to the total endocranial volume. So this is how big the olfactory bulbs are with respect to the rest of the brain. Birds have a very poor sense of smell.
You can really think of it as that you look at mammals, and mammals are pretty dull colored. And one of the reasons that they're dull colored is because mammals don't see in color. There's very few mammals, only basically primates see in color. All that stuff you've heard about red capes and balls, it's not true. I mean, it's just that they see in black and white. Not only do birds see in color, they see in far more color than we do. They see way out into the infrared. So a lot of things that are, not the infrared, the ultraviolet rather, a lot of things that would appear white to us are brightly patterned. when birds view them, because they have tetrachromatic vision, so that they see lots of colors that we don't see and everything else. That's why one of the reasons that people have argued that they're brilliantly colored. Whereas mammals, they smell really well. So it's why that any of you who have, or bad, that if any of you have ever been in East Africa or places like that, that they always tell you that that wildebeest can smell a lion from a couple of kilometers away. And it's true, because that it's dogs, for instance, when they enter a McDonald's or something, can smell like the mustard immediately if there's any there. And it's a totally different pathway for both species recognition as well as just dealing with the world. And birds see really well, and I think that's what we're seeing in these plots.
Yeah, they see well, they don't smell well, basically. What this graph shows you is that birds have a very small olfactory system relative to the rest of their brain. And what we see is that there's another group of dinosaurs that also kind of mirrors this evolution. Oviraptorosaurs is a group of dinosaurs that I've done a lot of work on. But they also have a very poor sense of smell. And there's a significant overlap between birds and Oviraptorosaur dinosaurs, but all of those other non-avian coelurosaurs, things like Archaeopteryx and Tyrannosaurus and Velociraptor, they all fall outside of this distribution of living birds. So there's definitely some sort of parallel evolution going on between these two groups. If you look at Incisivosaurus, and this is in that lineage that I just showed you, that Oviraptorosaur lineage, well, Incisivosaurus has a very reduced olfactory system. It's got very small olfactory bulbs, so there's something going on there. But finally, if you look at Archaeopteryx, it still has a pretty extensive olfactory system. So there's a complex pattern going on once you get up near the origin of birds. There's a complex pattern of evolution going on with the olfactory system. Birds, like I said, have a very poor sense of smell, so they have very reduced olfactory bulbs. And so what it looks like is happening is that we're having convergent evolution, a convergent reduction of the olfactory system within Oviraptorosaur dinosaurs, as well as crown group birds or living birds. So this is kind of an interesting pattern that I don't know if we really expected to see that. Like I said, once we're able to partition the brain up into different sections, we can look at all these different sections. Again, this is we can look at different patterns of how the brain is evolving along that theropod dinosaur lineage. Again, a unique pattern that we see is that Oviraptorosaur dinosaurs have a really big cerebellum. The cerebellum is part of the hindbrain that controls, it's particularly in control of like movements and orientation, things like that. So Oviraptorosaurs have a very large cerebellum compared to all of these other non-avian dinosaurs, as well as crown birds that we were looking at.
And that's one of the things when I initially started thinking about this project, long before I met Amy, that I thought that bird brains are so incredibly big and very diverse, and it must have something to do with moving from a two-dimensional world to a three-dimensional world, to have this motor processing that you would have to be able to fly and to be able to navigate and do all these things that birds do. At that time, we didn't have this excellent set of fossils to be able to show that that's totally wrong, but it was a good initial starting point to be able to do this, but to show that things like there's no way these oviraptors could fly, there's no way tyrannosaurs could fly and stuff, but we see this iterative pattern and stuff that of cerebellums that much larger than we would have ever expected in these
Very
things
so.
that didn't fly at all. So
this is something that really surprised me, actually. I didn't expect to see Oviraptorosaurs to have such a large cerebellar volume. And looking at the morphology, in things like Tyrannosaurus or these more basal taxa, you can't really see what's going on in the hindbrain, and that's because they didn't fill the brain as completely as those specimens or those animals that were more close to the origin of birds, and then of course crown group birds themselves. And so when they don't fill that cranial cavity, basically what you get are a lot of venous sinuses. So you don't get as good a view of what's going on in the brain as you do within things that do more completely fill that cranial cavity with their brain. But what is going on? What gives Oviraptorosaurs that really huge volume that we're seeing that puts them above all of the other taxa, all the other specimens that we were looking at? If you can kind of see those kind of lateral, these projections off to the sides of the cerebellum in blue, that's something that we call the flocculus. And the flocculus actually has to do with gaze stabilization. So as things are, running around trying to catch prey, the gaze stabilization helps them keep focus on what helps them keep focus on what they're after. So if it's a bug, it helps them focus on the bug and kind of block out all of the other things around them. And so it looks like Oviraptorosaurs had huge floccular lobes, which is really, again, something I didn't expect to see, but something that's definitely there and is adding to that cerebellar volume.
And one of the things about gaze stabilization that's pretty interesting in living birds is that, remember, like I said before, not only do birds see in more colors than we do, they see far better than we do. So if you could imagine sitting in this room and reading kind of like the eye chart you have to do at the DMV, but you're reading it all the way down at the end of that gallery. A bird can do that. A lot of birds can do that. That's why things like hawks and eagles can spot little mice that are like this big from 800 feet in the air.
Yeah.
So that the flocculus in living birds, especially in predatory birds, is really large. So, and I mean, I think the best way to explain it in the digital world and stuff, it's like looking at a monitor, and taking like a really old monitor from 15 years ago and comparing that to like a retinal display on, a new machine, just like how much more precise it is when you zoom in. And that to think that like the retinal display is only our retina, but the retina of a bird is maybe 3 times better than or even more than our retina is, so that they can really see. Mm-hmm. So this has a lot to do with that whole floccular area of the cerebellum.
Yeah, so I don't know what Oviraptorosaurs were doing, but they were very focused on whatever they were looking for. One final thing I want to look at is the brainstem volume. And again, this is not something, I'm not quite sure what's going on here, but there's definitely been a shift in the size of the brainstem from those non-avian theropods to modern birds. Non-avian theropods have a much larger brainstem than living birds do. And, the brainstem is basically just controlling, everyday things like, little heartbeat and things like that. Just the things that keep you alive, basically. So the non-avian theropods had very large brainstems relative to living birds.
And some people have argued previously, even on the basis of no information, because this is the first empirical data that's ever been shown about this, that these kind of observed bigger brainstems had to do with body mass. These are like bigger animals would have bigger bodies, so they'd have to have bigger brainstems to be able to control them. But if you look at this, that there's a lot of really small things, like the bottom down there, that thing you see, Shibuya desert eye and stuff. I mean, that's half the mass of a Thanksgiving turkey. So like that, we're talking like still really small animals, but they have much larger brainstems.
And then finally, this is the really important part. This is showing cerebral volume versus total endocranial volume, and there's a very tight correlation between these two variables. This just kind of indicates that cerebral expansion is incredibly important in the expansion of the brain overall. Cerebral expansion started much earlier in the history of the avian lineage than we initially thought. It didn't start at Archaeopteryx, which was thought to be the first bird. It didn't start at crown grape birds or living birds. Instead, it started back here at the base of Maniraptor, and this is a group that includes dinosaurs like Oviraptor and Velociraptor. It includes Archaeopteryx and living birds as well. But I think the take-home message here is that the cerebral expansion overall, as well as the expansion of the total brain, occurs much earlier in the history than we ever thought it might occur. And that's reflected in the shape of the cerebrum as well. Here's this tyrannosaurid, so this is kind of the primitive condition within the dinosaurs that we're looking at. And there's a very shallow brain that's not very large, not very it's not expanded much towards the back of the endocast. You see this, again, that group of dinosaurs I just mentioned, oviraptorosaurs, it looks about the same. But once you get into this group that includes dinosaurs like, Microraptor, Velociraptor, Archaeopteryx, once you get into this group, there's a change in the shape of the cerebrum as well, so that it has kind of a pear-shape morphology to it. There's not just an expansion, but there's also a change in shape of the cerebrum that's going on at this point on the evolutionary tree of dinosaurs too. We have these features that are characteristic for all of these different groups of dinosaurs. We have features that are characteristic for Maniraptora, so this is the group that includes oviraptorosaur dinosaurs, plus like Velociraptor, Archaeopteryx, living birds. We have features that are characteristic for oviraptorosaurs, as well as paravies, and we have characters that are diagnostic for just living birds. But what's interesting is that we don't have characters so far that are diagnostic for a group called Aviale, and that's that group that includes Archaeopteryx plus living birds. So there's nothing new that occurs at Archaeopteryx, basically. That morphology that's there evolved much earlier in its history.
It's one of the things that we see iteratively within dinosaurs. And when I got into this game a long time ago, that there was birds and there was dinosaurs. And now you can't say what's a bird and what's a dinosaur. And 20 years ago, if you would have told me that we would be like, looking at the brain of dinosaurs for characters to be able to understand their genealogy and something about their behavior, I would have said there was no chance. But that just remove it from your head that there's birds and there's dinosaurs. I mean, it's just like that there's humans are a type of primate and primates are a type of mammal. Birds are a kind of dinosaur and a kind of theropod dinosaur. And the theropod dinosaurs, which are most closely related to birds, things like Velociraptor and things like that, if there's one running around down here right now, you would just say it's a stupid-looking bird or something, because that's what it would look like to you. It would behave like that. It would act like that. Its brain would have functioned like that. It would have been all of those things.
Absolutely. And so I think that's the take-home message from all of this, is that big brains actually evolved much earlier in the evolutionary history of the avian lineage than we thought previously. The bird lineage starts to expand its brain much earlier than the onset of powered flight. So either it has nothing to do with flight, or some of those dinosaurs that, the four-winged dinosaurs that are coming out of China right now, maybe they didn't have powered flight, but maybe they had the neurological capacity for some type of flight. Like it says here, the brain of Archaeopteryx is really not uniquely avian. It started much earlier in that evolutionary history than we previously thought.
A lot of it is like kind of historical baggage, because is that back in the early days of evolutionary theory, that about the same time as The Origin of Species was written, they found the perfect fossil. I mean, they found the fossil that really showed it, because before that there was just types. There was like reptiles and there was birds. And then 2 years after Darwin published The Origin of Species, they dragged up the first good Archaeopteryx specimen. And here was something which was truly transitional. It was something that had reptilian features as far as like a long tail and teeth and all this kind of stuff, but it clearly had feathers. And so, that was it. So they defined that as the first bird. And that lasted for about 125 years or so. And then now all of a sudden is that all these other things, not just feathers, but physiology, now brains, all these other things have just cascaded down the tree, and that they become typical characteristics of lots of different dinosaur groups. So it's, there is no such thing as a bird separate from a dinosaur. Take-home message.
Absolutely. That's the point. That's what you get from this. But with that, I just want to say thank you all for listening to our whole spiel and the open it up.